Let's talk about the brain. This is the part of the nervous system that, at least for a psychologist, is by far and away the most interesting part. Not that other parts of the nervous system aren't important, but this is where all the good stuff happens from a psychological point of view. Most of you know what a brain looks like, and there's some pictures on the slide here. The brain in the upper right-hand corner is more the color of what a living brain looks like. The brain in the lower right-hand corner is the color that brains become after they've been laying around for a while in formaldehyde. We have a lot of brains in the psychology department, and when I teach the course live and in person, I bring some brains into class and we get to pass them around and people get to take a look at a real human brain up close. Anyway, in this PowerPoint slideshow, we're going to be talking about what the different parts of the brain are and a little bit about what they're responsible for. It took us a long time to figure out what different parts of the brain did because we simply didn't have the technology to study brain function in any meaningful way. What had to happen most of the time was for some accident to occur to an interesting person, and then after the fact, scientists would study the individual's brain to try to figure out what had been responsible for different functions. One of the most famous of these stories is the story of Phineas Gage. There's a video clip that goes along with this module that I want you to watch. It's a dramatization of the Phineas Gage story, and you'll find it very entertaining. But in the history of brain science, Phineas Gage is a very famous person. He was a railroad guy in Vermont in the middle of the 1800s, and he was injured one day because an explosion drove this very heavy metal tamping iron right through his skull. The diagram there shows you the path that it took going up through the jaw and then out the top of the head. Gage didn't even lose consciousness, but it was clear that something pretty profound had happened. And against all odds, he survived this accident, but he was never the same. After he recovered, his emotional regulation was completely disrupted, his personality had changed, and he was a very different person than he had been before the accident. This was very exciting for scientists at the time, and it's important for psychologists because this was one of the first demonstrations to conclusively show that things that we think of about human beings, like their personality and their emotions, are in fact biologically based things. And by all means, watch the clip and you'll find it quite interesting, I'm sure. Okay, so here's a diagram of what the brain looks from the left side. And let me just point out a few of the structures and tell you a little bit about what they do. The green thing coming up from the bottom of the picture is the top of the spinal cord, and that runs into something that's called the brain stem. The brain stem is the most basic part of the brain, and it's responsible for life-sustaining functions such as breathing, heart rate, swallowing. It's involved in sleep processes. And it's the part of the brain that essentially keeps you alive. When we talk about somebody being brain dead, usually we're talking about a person where the only part of the brain that seems to be functioning anymore is this brain stem. As important as the brain stem is, we're not going to be talking about it very much in this course because it's not involved in many psychological functions, but you certainly want your brain stem to be working well. The cerebellum is that sort of striped part of the brain in pink in this diagram, kind of on the bottom and the back of the brain. The cerebellum is responsible for a lot of functions like your sense of balance and coordinating movement. So a person who has had damage to the cerebellum may have trouble with muscle movements. It's also responsible for coordination between different body parts. It's responsible for aiming. For example, if you're aiming a rifle at a target, the cerebellum is very important to your ability to do that. It's also involved in your sense of rhythm. When you hear and you're able to recognize that rhythm and know exactly how long you should wait before you give the final two knocks, all of that is part of what the cerebellum does. Again, interesting stuff, but not something we're going to talk about nearly as much. Most of the time, we're going to talk about the cortex, which is the largest part of the brain, the wrinkly outer layer of the brain at the top. But before we talk about that, let's dig down underneath it and look at some subcortical brain structures. There are many important parts of the brain that are hidden down underneath the cortex, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. Sometimes this part of the brain is known as the reptilian brain, but I don't know a single scientist who likes that terminology. But where it comes from is the fact that all animals share essentially the same basic structure in their subcortical brain structures. We've all evolved from common ancestors, and so we all have hypothalamuses and hippocampuses and amygdalas, which I'll talk about those things in a moment. The thing that separates human brains from other brains is essentially the size of the cortex. We have a much larger cortex than most other animals. There are a few, like dolphins and elephants, that come pretty close or may in fact be a little larger than human cortexes. But that's the thing that really makes us different. Also, our cortex is very highly specialized in ways that the cortexes of other animals are not quite so specialized. So we'll get into all that in a moment. But just to take a quick tour through some of these subcortical structures, the basal ganglia is the reward center of the brain. It's the pleasure center. It's the part of the brain that lights up and fires when you're enjoying something, when you're having sex, when you're taking pleasurable drugs, when you're basically eating good food. Any of those things will excite the basal ganglia. The thalamus is kind of the switchboard of the brain. It's the place where sensory information is coming in from various brain parts, and it gets organized and redirected to where it needs to go through the thalamus. The hippocampus is very much involved in memory, and specifically moving information from short-term memory to long-term memory. And individuals who have had damage in their hippocampus may entirely lose that capability of ever forming any new memories. And you'll hear more about that in another PowerPoint presentation in this module. The amygdala is very much involved with emotional regulation, and brain damage to this part of the brain can disrupt emotional life. So, for example, if you mess with the amygdala in rats, you can make them hyper-aggressive or hyper-fearful. The hypothalamus is involved in all kinds of different things. In fact, if you're taking a quiz and the question is asking you what part of the brain is responsible for this function, and you don't really know the answer and you just want to take a guess, the hypothalamus might be a good guess because it's involved in eating and drinking, temperature regulation. It's the thing that makes you shiver when you're cold, makes you sweat when you're hot. And it's involved in emotion as well and sexual activity. So the hypothalamus is involved in a lot of different things. But let's get back to the cortex. The cortex is divided into two halves, the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. And there's a separate PowerPoint slideshow for hemispheric specialization. But each hemisphere has the same lobes on it. There's the frontal lobe, which is the part of the brain in the front, which is why it's called the frontal lobe. And this is where conscious thinking and planning takes place. So as you're studying for the quiz in this class, and when you're sitting down taking the quiz, it's the frontal lobe of your brain that's responsible for making that happen. That's where conscious thinking goes on. The parietal lobe is that red area up on the top of the brain. There's one on the left side and one on the right side. And this part of the brain is responsible for processing sensory information. So when you're smelling things or tasting things, that information is getting kind of processed and interpreted by the parietal lobe. The temporal lobe, the green area, is on the side of the head. It's responsible for auditory and visual recognition. So your ability to see and hear to some extent is located in the temporal lobe, but most of the visual stuff takes place in the occipital lobe, in the very back part of the brain. That yellow area, that's the occipital lobe, And this is the thing that allows you to see. A person who gets brain damage in the back of their head may actually go blind, even though there's nothing at all wrong with their eyes or their optic nerves. But this part of the brain is necessary for you to be able to see. This diagram illustrates how exquisitely specific things are located in the brain. The frontal cortex, as we've already said, is involved in conscious thinking, but near the back end of the frontal lobe, there's an area known as the motor cortex. And this is the part of the brain that's responsible for voluntary muscle movements. And you can see it kind of highlighted in a reddish, brownish strip with the word motor pointing at it. You'll notice that there are very specific locations for different body parts: the tongue, the lips, the fingers, the shoulder, the elbow. They all have their own little niche in the motor cortex when you want to move these things. Just across that gap between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, the central sulcus, you'll notice that there are corresponding areas on the sensory cortex in the parietal lobe that correspond to the parts on the motor cortex. So, for example, at the top of the diagram there, you'll notice that where your feet are controlled by the motor cortex is adjacent to where sensory information from your feet gets registered. So if somebody steps on your foot and you react by pulling your foot away, that information doesn't have to travel very far from the sensory input to the muscle output. This slide also provides a good illustration of highly specialized areas in the brain. Most people have their speech areas located on the left side of the brain in the left hemisphere, and we'll talk more about that in another PowerPoint show. But here you can see that in the left hemisphere of most individuals, you've got these two areas, Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Broca's area is located right where the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe come together. Wernicke's area is located right where the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe come together. Broca's area is the part of the brain that's responsible for generating speech. It's not responsible for making noise or just shouting or roaring, but grammatically correct language is controlled through Broca's area. Wernicke's area, on the other hand, is responsible for interpreting and understanding spoken language. Damage to either parts of these brain areas can disrupt either the ability to speak, in the case of Broca's area, or the ability to understand spoken language, in the case of Wernicke's area. We'll talk more about that when we cover psychological problems due to brain damage in another PowerPoint slide in this module.